Listen to the wind. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American West, there is a specific frequency to the howling of a winter storm that does not just freeze the skin, it terrifies the soul. It is the sound of nature reclaiming its absolute authority over the fleeting, fragile empires of men. The year is 1887. The month is January. We are in the high-altitude desert of the San Luis Valley, in the Colorado Territory. History books will remember these days as the Great Die-Up, a climatic apocalypse, a cyclonic bomb of unprecedented fury that would wipe out millions of cattle and bury entire trains beneath mountains of relentless white. Inside a sprawling, magnificent two-story Victorian mansion, a man is losing his mind. His name is Rogelio Velasquez. He is a cattle baron, a man of the New Age, a man who believes that wealth is a shield against the elements. But tonight, his wealth is entirely useless. The temperature outside has plummeted to a staggering 46 degrees below zero. The wind is battering his home at 60 miles per hour. The structural timbers of his $3,200 architectural marvel, built to mimic the aristocratic elegance of Boston and Chicago, are shrieking under the pressure. The iron nails are contracting in the deep freeze, popping out of the wood with sharp cracks that sound like pistol shots in the dark. Rogelio is on his knees in the grand parlor, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating panic. He is swinging a heavy iron axe into a beautiful, imported mahogany dining chair. Splinters of expensive wood fly across the frozen floorboards. He hurls the broken pieces into a roaring fireplace. He has already burned the bookshelves. He has burned the silk curtains. He has even burned his youngest daughter's hand-carved wooden crib. Yet, the cold is winning. Rogelio's modern, expensive home is a thermodynamic nightmare. The massive, roaring fire he has built is betraying him. To sustain its massive flames, the chimney is acting as a giant vacuum, violently sucking the remaining warm air out of the room and forcing icy, sub-zero drafts to rush in through every microscopic crack in the wooden walls and floorboards just to replace it. The harder he feeds the fire, the colder the drafts become. Physics is a cruel and impartial judge to those who ignore her laws. In the corner of the room, huddled beneath every woolen blanket and bear pelt they own, his wife and children are weeping silently. Their tears are freezing to their eyelashes. Rogelio drops the axe. He looks down at his hands. The tips of his fingers are turning a dull, lifeless black. Hypothermia is no longer a threat. It is an invading army that has breached the gates. He realizes, with a crushing wave of despair, that his family is going to freeze to death inside a monument to his own vanity. But let us swing the pendulum of our story. Let us leave this freezing wooden tomb and travel exactly 3 miles away, across the howling, blinding white wasteland. Here, under the exact same apocalyptic sky, in the exact same deadly cyclonic bomb, there is a silence that feels almost holy. The deafening 60-mile-per-hour roar of the blizzard is reduced to nothing but a soft, distant murmur, like the sound of an ocean heard from inside a seashell. We are underground. Inside a modest, semi-buried room, a 72-year-old widow named Soledad Montoya is sitting in a rocking chair. She is not shivering. She is not wearing a heavy bison coat. She is draped in a simple black shawl, humming a quiet melody from her childhood. The temperature inside this space is a stable, miraculous 68 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no roaring fireplace sucking the oxygen from the room. There is only a tiny, battered tin stove, bought for pennies from a scrapyard, quietly burning a small handful of dried sagebrush twigs just to heat a kettle of water. Soledad pours herself a cup of fresh mint tea. She inhales the steam. her dark eyes reflecting the soft, golden glow of a single oil lamp. The air around her does not smell of fear or freezing dust. It smells of damp, fertile earth. It smells of life. Along the southern wall of her subterranean refuge, safely tucked behind thick panes of salvaged, scratched glass, an impossible sight defies the frozen hellscape outside. Geraniums are blooming with vibrant red petals. Long green vines of winter squash are creeping along the adobe walls. Soledad reaches out with her arthritis-worn, calloused hand and gently touches the soil of a small terracotta pot. She smiles. A tiny green tomato is forming on the vine. In the middle of the deadliest winter of the century, this elderly woman has a thriving garden. She steps onto the floor barefoot. The dark river stones beneath her feet are warm, radiating a gentle, invisible heat upward into her bones. She is not fighting the winter. She is being cradled by the earth. How is this possible? How does a frail 72-year-old widow, discarded by her own family and banished to a barren, rocky wasteland, sit in absolute comfort while the wealthiest men in the territory face agonizing deaths in their mansions? How did a dirt hole, built with 24 dozen 50s worth of scrap materials, utterly defeat a $3,200 fortress of modern engineering? To understand the profound justice of this winter, we cannot start in the snow. We must go back to the sweltering heat of the summer. We must go back 6 months to a dining room table where a fatal mistake was made, the mistake of mocking the ancient wisdom of the earth. But before we journey back to the arrogance of that July evening, I must ask you to pause. If you believe, as we do, that the true wealth of humanity lies not in arrogant monuments of fragile wood and paper money, but in the forgotten quiet wisdom of our ancestors, then join our tribe. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this chronicle with those who need to remember how strong we truly are. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this story unfold? Write it below, and let us see how far the embers of this ancient fire can reach. Now, let us return to the year 1886. Let us witness the fall of the proud. July of 1886 descended upon the San Luis Valley not as a season, but as an anvil. Under the blinding, cloudless expanse of the high-altitude sky, the air did not merely blow. It shimmered and boiled, distorting the horizon into a watery mirage. The earth cracked open in parched, thirsty webs. In the heart of this blistering cauldron stood Rogelio Velázquez's newly finished estate. It was a soaring, 3-story monument to modern ambition, built with imported timber, factory-machined nails, and large panes of fragile glass. It cost $3,200, an astronomical fortune at the time. Yet, on this particular afternoon, this expensive fortress was an absolute instrument of torture. The elite men of the territory had gathered in Rogelio's grand dining room. There was Mr. Harrison, a wealthy banker from Denver, who had just purchased 10,000 acres of indigenous land with a single stroke of a gold-tipped fountain pen. Sitting across from him was Deacon Miller, a rigid, severe man who wore his morality like a starched collar, firmly believing that prosperity was a direct reward from the Almighty, and poverty a symptom of spiritual decay. They were men of the future, men of industry, and they were suffocating. Inside the house, the temperature was unbearable. The sun had been beating against the thin, painted wooden siding since dawn. Wood, you see, is a fibrous, hollow material. When it is cut thin and nailed into a box that sits entirely above the ground, it possesses almost zero thermal mass. It cannot absorb or store heat. It merely allows it to pass through and become trapped. The grand dining room was a wooden oven. Sweat beaded on Mr. Harrison's forehead, dripping onto his pristine, starched collar. He fanned himself frantically with a linen napkin, his face flushed a dangerous crimson. "This heat is an absolute devil," Harrison complained, swatting at a fly that buzzed lazily over the roasted beef. "It is the price of civilization, I suppose. Building a proper modern estate out here in this savage territory comes with its discomforts." He took a sip of warm wine. "But I tell you, Rogelio, it is far better than living in those primitive, squalid mud huts the natives and the old Mexicans use. Dirt is for the dead, not for gentlemen." Deacon Miller nodded solemnly, dabbing his neck. "Amen to that, Mr. Harrison. God gave us the saw and the steel mill to rise above the beasts of the field. To dwell in the dirt is an insult to progress." Rogelio smiled nervously, desperate for their approval. He had shaved his mustache to look more like the politicians in Washington. He wore a heavy English wool suit that scratched at his skin, ignoring his own profound discomfort to project an image of wealth. In the darkest corner of the dining room, sitting in perfect silence, was Soledad. She wore a stark, simple black dress that fell to her ankles. Her silver hair was braided tightly against her scalp. She smelled faintly of wood smoke and wild sage, a scent that cut through the heavy, expensive perfumes of the men. She was 72 years old. Her hands, resting in her lap, were a map of hard labor, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin tanned like ancient, cured leather. She had not been invited to speak. Her presence in her son-in-law's house was tolerated only as an unspoken charity, a lingering shadow of Rogelio's past that he was desperately trying to erase. But the earth does not remain silent when it is mocked by fools. Soledad raised her head. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed the gravelly, undeniable weight of a falling stone. "Mud breathes, Mr. Harrison," she said. The clinking of silverware stopped instantly. The room fell into a dead, tense silence. Rogelio's face drained of color. "I beg your pardon, madam?" Harrison asked, his eyes narrowing. "Mud breathes," Soledad repeated, her dark eyes locking onto the wealthy banker without a trace of fear. "Wood chokes. This grand house of yours is an oven because it fights the sun instead of inviting it in. The earth is a blanket. In the summer, she offers you her coolness. In the winter, she offers you her gathered warmth. Only a fool builds an empty wooden box and expects the sky to respect it." Deacon Miller let out a sharp, condescending snort. "Old wives' tales and superstitious nonsense. You cannot build a modern empire out of dirt, old woman." "Mother, please!" Rogelio hissed through clenched teeth, his face burning with humiliation. "Do not bore my guests with the ignorance of the past." Soledad did not argue. She simply lowered her eyes back to her empty plate. But the damage, irreversible and absolute, had been done. That evening, after the banker and the deacon had ridden away in their fine carriages, Rogelio summoned his wife, Maria, and his mother-in-law into the library, a room lined with leather-bound books that no one in the house actually read. Rogelio stood by the window, refusing to look at the frail, elderly woman who had helped raise his own children. "This cannot continue," Rogelio declared, his voice trembling with a mixture of cowardice and misplaced pride. "My business is expanding. I need to entertain investors, men of capital. And frankly, Doña Soledad, your presence is a disruption. You confuse the children with your herbs and your old stories. They need a modern American upbringing." Maria let out a stifled sob, pressing her hands to her mouth, but she dared not defy her husband. In 1886, a woman without money had no voice. Soledad did not weep. In her bloodline, dignity was the only currency that could never be stolen, not by bankers nor by cowardly men. She stood tall, though her spine ached with every inch. "What are you saying, Rogelio?" she asked, her tone entirely devoid of panic. Rogelio finally turned, pulling a folded piece of paper and a small leather pouch from his vest. "I own the northern parcel, the one bordering the Barranco del Muerto, Dead Man's Gulch. It is 40 acres of useless clay and volcanic rock. It cannot hold cattle, and it cannot be farmed. But it is land. I will give you the deed to it. And this." He tossed the pouch onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a pathetic, muffled clink. $25 to set yourself up, or I can arrange a carriage to take you to the charity asylum in Pueblo. Maria gasped. "Dead Man's Gulch? Rogelio, that is 3 miles away. There are no trees. There is no water. It is a wasteland. She will die out there." "It is what I have," Rogelio snapped coldly, his vanity entirely blinding his conscience. "She has her pride. Let her see what her dirt and her old ways can buy her." Soledad stepped forward. She did not look at her weeping daughter, knowing that if she did, her heart might finally break. She reached out with her crooked, scarred fingers and picked up the paper deed. Then she picked up the $25. It was a sum so insultingly small it would not even buy the glass in Rogelio's front door. "Do not weep for me, Maria," Soledad said softly. Then she looked dead into Rogelio's eyes. "Keep your charity asylum, Rogelio, and do not worry about my old soul. Worry about your painted wooden walls when the north wind finally decides to speak." The next morning, before the sun had fully crested the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, Soledad Montoya walked away from the $3,000 mansion. She possessed no horse. She had no wagon. She pushed a rusted wooden handcart. Inside, it was the entirety of her earthly wealth: a thin mattress stuffed with straw, 2 heavy wool blankets she had woven herself, a blackened cast-iron cooking pot, an axe, a canvas bag of heirloom seeds, and a heavy iron shovel with a wooden handle worn perfectly smooth by decades of labor. The 3-mile walk to the Barranco del Muerto was an agonizing pilgrimage. The July sun beat down upon her black dress like a physical weight. The fine, alkaline dust of the trail coated her boots and filled her throat. Every push of the squeaking cart sent a jolt of arthritic pain up her arms and into her shoulders. But she did not stop. She did not look back at the towering wooden house shrinking in the distance. When she finally arrived at the gulch, it was exactly as Rogelio had described it: desolate, unforgiving, a sloping hillside of hard, red clay littered with sharp volcanic rocks and dotted with dry, thorny scrub brush. There was no shade. The hot wind howled through the canyon like a hungry ghost. Any normal person, armed with only $25 and a shovel, would have fallen to their knees and surrendered to despair. They would have seen a graveyard. Soledad Montoya parked her handcart. She took a sip of warm, metallic-tasting water from her canteen. She wiped the sweat and dust from her deep-lined brow. Then she looked at the sloping, south-facing hill of solid clay. She did not see a wasteland. She saw a canvas. She saw the embrace of a mother waiting to be opened. She reached into the cart, her fingers wrapping around the smooth wooden handle of the shovel. The true work of survival was about to begin. The sound of a steel shovel striking hard, sun-baked clay is a lonely, desperate rhythm. Thwack, scrape, thwack, scrape. For the first 2 weeks of August, that was the only sound in the Barranco del Muerto. The townspeople of San Luis, safely shaded on their wooden porches, whispered about the crazy old widow digging her own grave out in the wasteland. They watched the dust rising from the distant hill, shaking their heads at the pathetic spectacle of a 72-year-old woman fighting the earth. But Soledad Montoya was not fighting the earth. She was remembering it. Every time she paused to catch her breath, leaning her weary weight against the smooth wooden handle of her shovel, she closed her eyes and saw the faces of her ancestors. She remembered her grandfather, a man who had lived high in the rugged Sierras of Chihuahua. She remembered the ancient Puebloans, the first peoples of this very desert, who had thrived here 1,000 years before the first iron nail was ever forged. They did not build fragile, hollow boxes on top of the ground to challenge the wind. They knew that the sky was a temperamental tyrant, prone to fits of blazing fury and freezing rage. The earth is a mother, her grandfather had told her when she was just a little girl, his hands calloused and stained with adobe. You do not stand on her shoulders to fight the winter. You crawl into her lap to survive it. Wood rots, canvas tears, but the stone remembers, and the mud breathes. With those words echoing in her mind, Soledad wiped the sweat from her brow, ignoring the sharp, stinging pain in her arthritic hands, and went back to digging. She was not digging randomly. What the townspeople mistook for the chaotic thrashing of a madwoman was, in fact, an absolute masterpiece of ancient bioclimatic engineering. First, she had chosen the location with mathematical precision. She selected the south-facing slope of a small hill. She knew that in the northern hemisphere, the winter sun travels low across the southern horizon. By digging directly into the southern face, she was creating a natural solar trap. She excavated a rectangular room, roughly 12 feet by 16 feet, digging straight into the hill until the back wall was 6.5 feet deep underground. It took her 3 agonizing weeks. Her hands bled. Her back screamed in agony. But at that depth, Soledad had tapped into the greatest secret of the natural world: thermal inertia. You see, the air above ground is entirely unstable. In the San Luis Valley, it can boil at 100 degrees in July and plummet to 40 below zero in January. But dirt is heavy. Dirt is stubborn. Dirt is slow. It takes months for heat or cold to penetrate deep into the ground. Because of this massive thermal inertia, the Earth at a depth of 6.5 feet maintains a constant, unwavering temperature of about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, around 13 degrees, entirely immune to the weather above. While her son-in-law, Rogelio, would have to burn mountains of expensive coal just to heat his freezing wooden mansion from sub-zero temperatures up to a livable state, Soledad never had to worry about the cold. The Earth provided a permanent baseline of 55 degrees. To survive, she only needed to elevate the temperature of her room by a mere 10 degrees. And for that, she needed to capture a star. One Tuesday morning, Soledad walked the 3 miles back into town. She walked past the general store, past the saloon, and went straight to the scrapyard. There, she spent $15 of her $25 on something that convinced the entire town she had finally lost her mind: glass. She did not buy fine, clear window panes like the ones in Rogelio's mansion. She bought a stack of heavy, scratched, discarded greenhouse frames that no one else wanted. What does a woman living in a dirt hole need with glass? The scrapyard owner laughed, taking her wrinkled dollar bills. To eat the sun, Soledad replied quietly. She dragged the heavy glass frames back to her gulch. She installed them across the entire southern facade of her excavated room. But she did not install them vertically. She leaned them back at a precise 45-degree angle. She did not know trigonometry, but she knew shadows. She knew that this exact angle would allow the low, weak rays of the winter sun to pierce deep into the back of her room, while the harsh, high sun of the summer would bounce off the angled glass, keeping the room perfectly cool in July. But capturing the sun was only half the battle. If you catch the heat, you must have a way to hold it, or it will simply vanish when the sun goes down. For her floor, Soledad did not leave the bare dirt. She spent days walking down to a dry riverbed, hauling back large, dark, heavy river stones. She laid them meticulously across the floor. Behind the angled glass, she built a thick, waist-high wall out of pure adobe clay and more dark stones. These were not decorations. They were a battery, a massive, silent thermal battery. During the short, freezing winter days, the sun's rays would pierce the glass and strike the dark stones and the adobe wall. The dense mass of the stone would swallow the heat, absorbing it like a sponge absorbing water. The rocks would grow hot to the touch. Then, when the sun set and the brutal night cold descended, the stones would slowly, steadily radiate that trapped heat back into the sealed room, acting as an invisible, silent stove that required no wood, produced no smoke, and never went out. To finish her fortress, she laid heavy aspen logs across the top of the excavation. She covered the logs with thick branches, then a layer of straw, and finally, she buried the entire roof under 2 solid feet of living earth and prairie grass. From a distance, the house completely vanished. It looked like nothing more than a gentle swell in the hillside with a strange, slanted glass eye staring at the southern sky. A wild goat could graze right over her ceiling and never know there was a human being living beneath its hooves. The total cost of Soledad Montoya's survival? $15 for the discarded glass. $5 for a rusted, cracked cast-iron stove she found in a ditch, which she placed in the back corner with a tin pipe running up through the earth roof, and $4.50 for a handful of iron hinges, nails, and a few wooden scraps for a heavy front door. Exactly $24.50. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Mr. Harrison the banker had just spent $450 to install an imported coal-fired boiler in his basement, convinced that British iron and fossil fuels were superior to the sun. Rogelio was still paying off the thirsty $200 debt for his wooden palace. As October rolled in, the leaves of the aspen trees turned a brilliant, dying gold, and the air took on a sharp, crystalline bite. The animals knew what was coming. Soledad watched the squirrels working with a frantic, desperate energy, burying pine nuts deeper than usual. She saw massive, dark V formations of geese fleeing south weeks earlier than they ever had. The coyotes singing in the gulch at night had already grown coats twice as thick as the year before. The earth was screaming a warning. But men who live in wooden boxes do not speak the language of the earth. One brisk afternoon, the mocking laughter of the elite finally arrived at Soledad's door. Mr. Harrison and Deacon Miller were riding through the gulch on horseback, inspecting land boundaries. They spotted the strange, dirt-covered mound and the glinting, slanted glass. They pulled their majestic horses to a halt, looking down at Soledad, who was carefully wiping the dust from her window panes. "Mrs. Montoya!" Harrison called out, his voice dripping with that unbearable, pitying condescension unique to the very rich. "Good Lord, woman, what have you done? It looks like a badger's den. Do you need me to send my ranch hands over to build you a proper timber shed? It isn't Christian to let an old woman live in a muddy tomb." Soledad did not stop wiping the glass. "The badgers survive the winter, Mr. Harrison. Your imported cattle freeze standing up. I would rather learn from the badger than from the banker." Deacon Miller stiffened in his saddle, his face souring. He looked at the structure with pure disdain, voicing the very doubts that a modern, logical mind would harbor. "This is madness, woman," the deacon barked. "You have no timber. You have no insulation. The dirt is damp and freezing. You are going to turn into a block of ice in that hole. And what is that old glass for? Glass is fragile. Glass cannot hold a fire. I don't need to hold a fire, Deacon, Soledad said smoothly, turning to look up at the men, the wind whipping her silver hair. I am catching the sun, and the earth is already warm if you have the humility to ask her. Harrison let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the canyon walls. The sun? In January? The sun is a pale ghost in winter, old woman. Wood and coal are the only things that will save you. You are defying progress, and progress will leave you behind to freeze. Mark my words, when the snows come, this hole will be your coffin. We shall see who floats and who sinks, gentlemen, Soledad replied quietly. She turned her back on the wealthy men and walked down the 2 earthen steps into her home. Behind her, she closed her heavy, mismatched wooden door. The laughter of the banker and the deacon faded as they rode away, confident in their money, confident in their wood, confident in their absolute dominion over nature. They did not know that 3 months later they would be dragging their frozen, dying bodies through the snow, begging the crazy widow to open that very same door, because November was ending, and the sky over the San Luis Valley was turning a sickly, bruised shade of yellow. The Great White Death was about to begin. The 9th of January, 1887, did not begin with a howl. It began with an eerie, suffocating silence. The sky over the San Luis Valley turned a sickly, bruised shade of yellow. The barometric pressure plummeted so fast that the old trappers in town felt their ears pop. The wind died completely. Not a single blade of dry grass twitched. The birds vanished from the sky, and the coyotes, usually vocal in the mornings, fell utterly mute. It was the deep, terrifying breath that nature takes right before it screams. By noon, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single hour, and then the white wall hit. It was not a snowstorm. It was a cyclonic explosion of ice. The wind slammed into the valley at 60 miles per hour, carrying billions of microscopic ice crystals that did not float, but flew horizontally like crushed glass. Visibility was instantly reduced to absolute zero. If a man held his hand out in front of his face, he would only see a blinding, tearing whiteness. This was the great die-up, the storm that would break the cattle barons, the storm that would prove, with brutal thermodynamic mathematics, who was right and who was wrong. Inside Rogelio Velázquez's $3,200 Victorian estate, the illusion of human supremacy shattered in the very first hour. The mansion, perched high on its stone foundation, caught the full, devastating broadside of the 60-mile-per-hour wind. The sheer kinetic force made the massive wooden structure groan like a sinking ship, but the true enemy was not the wind itself. It was the invisible physics of cold and pressure. Wood is a fibrous, porous material. In extreme, sudden freezes, wood violently contracts. The carefully measured joints of Rogelio's fine imported timber began to shrink and pull apart. The iron nails, freezing at a different rate than the wood, began to pop out of the siding with sharp, terrifying cracks. Suddenly, the house was no longer a sealed fortress. It was a sieve. Desperate, Rogelio ordered his ranch hands to shovel mountains of expensive Pennsylvania coal into the 3 massive stone fireplaces. He believed that if he just threw enough money into the fire, he could beat the winter. But fire is a living, breathing thing. To burn, it requires massive amounts of oxygen. As the colossal fires roared in the hearths, they created a violent updraft, sucking hundreds of cubic feet of warm air up the chimneys every single minute. This created a massive negative pressure zone inside the house. Nature abhors a vacuum. To replace the air escaping up the chimneys, the house violently inhaled the outside air through every shrinking window frame, every cracked floorboard, and every gap in the wooden siding. The harder Rogelio fueled the fires, the more violently the house pulled the 46-degree below zero blizzard inside. It was a fatal, inescapable loop of thermodynamic failure. The fireplaces were not heating the house, they were refrigerating it. By the second night, the temperature outside hit minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the grand dining room, where just 6 months prior Mr. Harrison had complained about the heat, the thermometer dropped to 10 degrees below zero. The water in the fine porcelain pitchers froze solid, cracking the expensive ceramic into pieces. The ink in Rogelio's fountain pen turned to black ice. Rogelio, wrapped in heavy bison furs, was tearing apart his own home. The coal had run out. He took his iron axe and smashed the imported mahogany dining chairs. He burned the bookshelves. He burned his ledgers. He burned his daughter's carved wooden crib. But the cold was an entity, a creeping shadow that swallowed the flames and spat out frost. In the corner, his wife Maria and their children huddled under a mountain of carpets, weeping. Rogelio looked at his own hands. The agonizing sting in his fingers had stopped an hour ago. That was not a good sign. The cessation of pain means the nerves are dying. The tips of his fingers were a dull, lifeless gray. In the heart of his modern, expensive empire, Rogelio Velázquez realized he was going to die. His pride, his arrogance, his desperate need to be seen as a modern aristocrat. None of it could raise the temperature of the room by a single degree. Miles away, the situation was even more grim for Deacon Miller. The deacon had preached that suffering purified the soul, but as the walls of his own timber-framed house turned white with indoor frost, he discovered that hypothermia offers no spiritual revelation. It only offers a slow, agonizing descent into the dark. His wife had been shivering violently for a day, but on the morning of the third day, the shivering suddenly stopped. Her body had run out of the energy required to shake. It was the final, terrifying stage before the heart surrenders. It was the morning of the fourth day when the wind finally offered a cruel, temporary truce. It did not stop snowing, and the temperature remained at 40 below, but the roaring 60-mile-per-hour gales dropped to a steady, manageable 30. Rogelio looked at his freezing wife and his silent children. "If we stay in this house," he whispered, his voice cracking, "we will be corpses by nightfall." They bundled themselves in every scrap of fabric left. They stumbled out the front door into a world that had been completely erased. Rogelio fought his way to the stables, praying to find a horse alive. He forced the barn door open. The majestic thoroughbreds, which had cost him hundreds of dollars, were dead. They were frozen solid, standing entirely upright in their stalls like macabre statues of ice. They would have to walk. And so began the march of the broken men. Rogelio carried his youngest daughter, who was too weak to cry. Maria stumbled behind him, clutching their son. Out in the blinding white void, they crossed paths with two other spectral figures dragging themselves through the waist-deep drifts. It was Deacon Miller, pulling his half-conscious wife on a makeshift sled made from a broken wooden door. The banker, Mr. Harrison, was nowhere to be seen. His fate, sealed inside his $450 boiler room that had run out of water and burst its pipes, would not be discovered until the spring thaw. The surviving elite of San Luis had been reduced to their most primal animal instincts: the social hierarchy, the money, the land deeds. It all dissolved into the absolute, overriding need for heat. And there was only one place in the entire valley where they knew heat still existed. They marched toward Dead Man's Gulch, toward the wasteland, toward the crazy widow. The 3-mile trek was a biblical agony. The snow dragged at their legs like wet cement. The air was so cold, it burned their lungs with every ragged breath. Rogelio fell to his knees twice, the urge to simply lie down in the soft white snow and go to sleep overwhelming his senses. It is a sweet, seductive lie that freezing people tell themselves, that resting for just a minute will not hurt. But the memory of Soledad's dark, calloused hands and the quiet certainty in her voice forced him back to his feet. When they finally staggered to the coordinates of the gulch, they almost walked right past it. There was no house. There was no structure to be seen. The blizzard had buried everything. But then Rogelio saw it, a gentle, smooth mound of snow on the south-facing slope. The brutal winds had swept over the aerodynamic curve of the buried roof, actually piling extra snow on top of it. Snow, ironically, is an incredible insulator. The storm had unwittingly added an extra layer of thermal protection to Soledad's home. And there, near the bottom of the mound, the wind had created a natural eddy, keeping a small, circular area clear of deep drifts. Rogelio dropped to his knees in the clearing. He saw the top of the heavy, crude wooden door. He saw the faint, wispy trail of smoke rising from the rusted tin pipe poking out of the frozen earth. He was a wealthy cattle baron. He wore a suit tailored in Chicago, but right now he was nothing more than a beggar at the gates of the earth. He raised his numb, blackened fist and pounded on the rough wood. "Mother!" Rogelio screamed, his voice tearing his freezing throat. "Mother, by the grace of God, please, open the door." The heavy, crude wooden door did not fly open with the wind. It was pulled inward, slowly, the rusted iron hinges groaning against the weight of the storm. And in that singular fraction of a second, the entire world view of Rogelio Velasquez and Deacon Miller was inverted forever. What struck their frostbitten faces was not the lethal, blinding sting of the blizzard. It was a physical wall of air. It was air that possessed weight, texture, and grace. It smelled of damp, fertile soil. It smelled of roasting potatoes, burning sage, and humanity. It was the undeniable, miraculous scent of life stubbornly persisting in the dark. Soledad Montoya stood in the threshold. She held a flickering oil lamp. There was no triumphant smirk on her weathered face. There was no cruel, self-righteous, "I told you so," dancing on her lips, though she had every right to say it. The arrogance of men was a frail, temporary disease. The cold was a permanent executioner. She simply stepped aside, making a sweeping gesture with her free hand, like a mother calling her foolish children out of the rain. "Come inside," Soledad commanded, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "Quickly, heat is gold. Do not spill it." Rogelio shoved his freezing wife and children down the 2 earthen steps. He followed them, dragging his legs as if they were dead logs of timber. Deacon Miller tripped over the threshold and collapsed face first onto the warm, dark river stones of the floor. Soledad pushed the heavy door shut, dropping a thick wooden beam across it. Instantly, the deafening 60-mile-per-hour roar of the apocalyptic beast outside was severed. It became nothing more than a muffled, impotent whisper against the 2 feet of solid earth above their heads. The silence inside the subterranean room was so profound it rang in their ears. It was sacred. But the first sensation the wealthy men felt was not relief. It was sheer, agonizing pain. When flesh that is minutes away from necrosis is suddenly introduced to a 68-degree room, the blood rushes back with a vengeance. It is the agonizing price of the thaw, the toll the body pays for wandering too close to the grave. Rogelio's children began to sob as their waxy white fingers turned a violent shade of purple. Soledad moved with the quiet efficiency of a battlefield general. "Do not sit near the stove yet," she ordered, pointing to the small cast-iron box in the corner. "The sudden heat will burst your skin. Sit on the stones at the back. Let the room embrace you slowly." Rogelio obeyed. He collapsed onto the low adobe wall that ran along the back of the room. He buried his face in his hands, shaking uncontrollably. And then, as his eyes finally adjusted to the soft golden light of the oil lamps, he saw the miracle. Directly in front of him, safely tucked behind the thick, angled panes of the discarded greenhouse glass, there was a vibrant, impossible explosion of green. He stared at the lush, leafy vines of winter squash. He stared at the bright red petals of the geraniums. He stared at the thick, healthy stalks of green onions. Outside, the temperature was 40 degrees below zero, a wind chill that could shatter cast iron. Inside, under a roof of dirt, a garden was thriving. Deacon Miller, still on his hands and knees on the stone floor, crawled slowly toward a small terracotta pot. He stared at the tiny green tomato hanging from the vine with an intensity that bordered on absolute madness. His breath hitched in his chest. "How?" the deacon whispered, his lips cracked and bleeding. "How is this possible? The devil himself is freezing the world outside. And here there is life." Soledad walked over and placed a warm clay mug of mint tea into his trembling hands. "God does not only live in the high heavens, deacon," she said softly, her eyes filled with a heavy, ancient pity. "He also lives in the mud. In fact, I believe he prefers the mud. It is much warmer." That night was the longest of their lives, and yet the shortest. There were now 7 people crammed into a space designed for one. The air grew heavy, thick with humidity, and the smell of wet wool, but not a single person complained. That stale air was warm air. Rogelio lay awake on the stone floor, staring up at the thick aspen logs of the ceiling. He could feel the heat radiating upward from the stones beneath him. It was a bizarre, unnatural sensation for a man conditioned to believe that heat only came from roaring fireplaces or expensive coal boilers. Here, the heat came from everywhere. The massive earthen walls around him were silently, continuously radiating the trapped solar energy of the past 3 months. He remembered the mockery. He remembered the laughter in the general store, the crazy widow and her dirt hole. The muddy tomb. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that the true tomb was his own $3,200 Victorian mansion. That magnificent, painted wooden box, with its towering ceilings and fragile glass, was nothing but a beautiful coffin. He had built his home to impress other men. Soledad had built her home to survive the sky. He had built from vanity. She had built from memory. He looked at his mother-in-law. She was dozing in her rocking chair, a patched wool blanket over her knees, looking frail and small. Yet, she was the most powerful creature within 100 miles. Her $24.50 shelter had utterly defeated the combined wealth of the San Luis Valley. The next morning, the storm raged on, but the temperature inside the Earthship remained stable. Soledad fed them. She did not offer them imported roasted beef or fine wine. She pulled potatoes from the ashes of her tiny stove. She served handmade flour tortillas and refried beans cooked with lard. They ate in a reverent, absolute silence. Deacon Miller, a man who usually blessed elite dinner tables with long, arrogant prayers in mispronounced Latin, simply bowed his head, holding his tin plate, and wept into his beans. "Forgive me, Doña Soledad," the deacon choked out, his tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "I called you a witch. I said this place was an offense to the Almighty." Soledad reached out and placed her scarred hand on his shaking shoulder. "Eat your food, Deacon. Pride does not fill the stomach, but the beans will." For 3 days, they remained sealed in the earth. For 3 days, the rigid social hierarchy of the 19th century West completely dissolved. The wealthy rancher, the moralistic deacon, and the discarded impoverished widow were made absolute equals before the immovable laws of thermodynamics. Finally, on the morning of the 4th day, the frequency of the world shifted. The howling stopped. Rogelio was the first to approach the door. He had to throw his shoulder against the thick wood, pushing hard against the snowdrift that had piled up outside. When the door finally gave way, the light that flooded into the dark room was blinding, violent, and absolute. They stepped out, one by one, sinking into waist-deep snow, blinking like moles dragged into the daylight. The sky was an aggressive, flawless blue. The sun beat down upon a world that had been entirely erased and rewritten in white. They looked down into the valley, and what they saw froze their blood far worse than the winter wind. The San Luis Valley was a graveyard. Where there were once miles of wooden fences, there were only strange, irregular white mounds. Thousands upon thousands of cattle had walked with the blistering wind until they hit a fence line, piled on top of each other, seeking warmth, and frozen into solid, tragic monuments of ice. Rogelio's grand mansion still stood in the distance, but it was a crippled skeleton. The wind had ripped the roof off the sweeping front porch. One of the massive stone chimneys had collapsed inward. The windows were shattered, allowing the snow to drift straight into the grand parlor, burying the imported rugs and the ruined piano. They slowly turned around and looked at Soledad's home. There was nothing to see. It was just a gentle, pristine hill of snow. The house was completely intact, buried safely beneath the frozen earth, perfectly insulated, perfectly quiet. It had not fought the wind. It had let the wind pass right over its back. Rogelio Velázquez fell to his knees in the snow. He looked at his trembling hands, which were finally regaining their color. He wept. He wept for his dead livestock. He wept for his shattered vanity, and he wept for the profound shame of his own blindness. He looked up at Soledad, who stood in the doorway, her black shawl fluttering in the crisp morning breeze. "Mother," Rogelio whispered, and this time the word was not an obligation. It was a confession. "Mother, you were right. About everything." Soledad looked out over the endless white horizon, her face calm and unreadable. "It is not about being right, Rogelio," she said softly. "It is about having a tomorrow. And today, we have a tomorrow. Now, get up. We must see if any of your animals survived." The Great Die-Up of 1887 changed the American West forever. It broke the arrogant cattle barons. It bankrupted the Eastern financiers who thought they could tame the high desert with checkbooks and steel wire. Nature collected its debt, and it collected it in full. But in the San Luis Valley, something far more profound changed. When the spring thaw finally came, revealing the bleached bones of a ruined empire, the wealthy men did not hire architects from Chicago to rebuild their mansions. Instead, they rode their wagons out to the Barranco del Muerto. They came with notebooks and measuring tapes. They came to speak to the elderly widow. They asked her about the angle of the glass. They asked her about the depth of the thermal mass. They asked her how many riverstones were needed to capture the winter sun. Rogelio did not rebuild his grand wooden parlor. He hired men with shovels. He built a new wing onto his home, a semi-buried south-facing room with adobe walls 3 feet thick. Deacon Miller preached a sermon on Easter Sunday that would be remembered for decades. He called it The Folly of Babel. Speaking of how men foolishly try to touch the sky with fragile towers of wood, when true salvation is often found by bowing one's head and touching the dirt. Soledad Montoya did not become rich. They did not build a bronze statue of her in the town square. She had no use for such hollow vanities. She had her garden to tend to. She lived for 18 more years in that home that cost $24.50. She watched her grandchildren run across her living roof in the summer, laughing as they plucked wildflowers from above her kitchen. She became the quiet, beating heart of the valley. When someone fell ill, they were brought to the grandmother's cave, because the warm, earthy air there was known to heal the lungs. When someone's heart was broken, they went to sit on her warm stone floor, letting the thermal mass of the earth absorb their grief. She passed away in 1905, at the age of 90. She did not die of cold. She did not die of disease. Her heart simply decided that it had beaten enough times, and it stopped, as peacefully as a setting sun dropping below the horizon. She was found in her rocking chair, bathed in the golden light of her slanted windows, cradled by the warmth of her home, until her very last breath. Today, if you travel to that specific gulch in Colorado, you will not find the wooden door or the rusted stove. Time and rain have reclaimed them, melting the adobe back into the hillside. But look around the modern high desert. Look at the earth ships in Taos. Look at the passive solar homes dotting the ridges. You will see her legacy in every south-facing window. You will see it in every thermal mass wall. The names of the arrogant bankers and the proud cattle barons are etched into marble tombstones that the wind is slowly erasing. But the wisdom of Soledad Montoya lives on in every home that chooses not to fight the winter, but to dance with it. This story is not just a ghost of 1887. It is a mirror held up to us today. Look at our modern world. Look at our fragile, complicated lives. We live in glass towers and wooden boxes that become deadly ovens in July and freezing tombs in January the moment the power grid fails. We have insulated ourselves with technology, but we have stripped ourselves of resilience. We have become incredibly proud and terrifyingly fragile. We have forgotten that our ancestors survived millennia without microchips, natural gas, or artificial heating. They survived not because they were primitive, but because they were the ultimate observers. They understood that the highest form of technology is not a machine that fights the earth, but the humility to understand where the sun rises and how to catch its fire in a simple stone. Soledad Montoya is a reminder that humility is the most advanced survival tool mankind has ever possessed. When the world grows cold, when the storms of life arrive to test the foundations of your empire, the answer is not to shout louder or build taller walls. The answer is to dig deep. The answer is to find the heat that the earth is already offering us, for free, if we only have the decency to bow our heads and accept it. If this story ignited a spark in your chest, if you feel the weight of that ancient truth vibrating in these words, do not let that fire die here in the dark. History loves to forget the Soledads of the world. It prefers to print the names of generals and billionaires. But we do not. We are the keepers of the forgotten embers. Subscribe to the channel if you believe the future desperately needs the wisdom of the past. Hit the like button so the modern algorithm knows that we still honor the resilience of our ancestors. Share this video with someone who is facing their own bitter winter right now. Remind them that no matter how hard the wind howls outside, there is always a sanctuary waiting, if we are willing to leave our pride at the door. I am the voice of the Legado Austral, the guardian of the Southern legacy. This has been a chronicle of resistance. Until the next storm, Keep the fire burning.